Welcome back to Old School Sports and our Out of the Park Baseball 24 playthrough of the Buffalo Wings. And we have just concluded the 2031 season. Our Buffalo Wings, who finished second in the National League East with the second best record in the National League, ended up finishing, not surprisingly, second in the National League, losing the NLCS to the New York Mets 4-2. So making it to Game 6 of the NLCS is the farthest that we have gotten. We also made it to a league championship series in 2028, the 1 year that we did win the NL East. But we didn't make it to 6 games that year. So from that perspective, I guess you could say it's the best season we've had. We've made the playoffs now 4 consecutive seasons in our 6 years as manager and general manager of the Buffalo Wings, but still yet to win a title, which is really what it's all about. And as some of you have pointed out in the comments to our most recent video, probably need to pay a little more attention to some of the managing, particularly in the playoffs. As those of you who have watched other series know, I prefer to play just as GM, and I generally play just as GM, but some of you over the last year or so had asked me to do a series with a manager and GM role, which I am doing this time. But I'm obviously still kind of just defaulting to letting the bench coach make most of the decisions for me and not spending a ton of time thinking about those settings as manager. So I probably do need to do a better job of that going forward. So thanks for the suggestions, and I will try to do that, even though I enjoy the game the most when I am just playing in the GM role. And that means we're actually heading into the time of year that's most enjoyable for me, because we've got arbitration and free agency and the winter meetings and the Rule 5 draft coming up over the next several episodes. So it's going to be a lot of team building coming up, which is the part of the game that I enjoy the most. But in this episode, we are going to do a quick recap of what our Buffalo Wings achieved and did not achieve this past season, and take a look at all of our players and kind of talk about who's definitely going to be back with us next year, who's definitely going to be gone next year, and perhaps most importantly, the players that we've got some difficult decisions ahead of on. And if you've got thoughts on what we should do with some of those decisions, would certainly love to hear them in the comments. Finished 94-68 this year, as I mentioned, was actually 4 games below our Pythagorean expectations. So it was a really good season. We finished strong with a 20-6 record in September, and then obviously went 7-6 in the playoffs overall, including the 4-2 loss to the Mets in that NLCS. Pretty productive season. We ended up 3rd in the National League in runs scored, and you can see we were in the top 4 or 5 in the league in just about every hitting category, except for walks and strikeouts. We were not so good in those aspects of the game. 1st in the NL in steals, 5th in base running. And we had the best pitching staff in the National League, 1st in runs allowed, 1st in bullpen ERA, 2nd in starters ERA. And you can see we were 1st or 2nd in the vast majority of pitching categories, 2nd in defensive efficiency, and 1st in zone rating. So it was a very strong regular season. Disappointing that with a team that finished 3rd in runs scored and 1st in runs allowed, we couldn't get a divisional title and home field advantage for the playoffs and a 1st-round bye in the playoffs. But those are the breaks. We did the best we could with the team in the playoffs. And if we have next season and we're anywhere close to 3rd in runs scored and 1st in runs allowed again, I think it'll probably be a pretty good 2032 for the Buffalo Wings. Turning to that excellent pitching staff, we're probably going to have some holes in the starting rotation next year, and they begin with potentially our top two starters. The good news is that Shohei Ohtani is going to be back with us. He triggered his $20 million vesting option for the final year of his contract with us by pitching 162 innings. The question that we have is, with his ratings on the pitching side still being fine, he still has a nice 5-pitch arsenal of above average to really good pitches. But his stuff overall is a little bit above average, movement below average, and he's an extreme fly ball pitcher. Control still good. But his performance has definitely been deteriorating over these last few years as he gets into his mid to late 30s. And there is an argument, given that we have an opening in a corner outfield spot. Do we make him a hitter next year in his final year potentially with us? Or do we bring him back as a starter for that $20 million contract? Certainly the 65 power and the 60 eye are both very attractive traits. And you look at particularly what we think he can still do against right-handed pitching. And he could be a pretty effective bat for us next year. 11-10 this year with a 3.52 ERA, but that 2.5 WAR was by far the worst WAR that he's put up for us in his 5 seasons in a Buffalo Wings uniform. So it's hard to imagine that next year, when he's playing the full year at age 37 and turning 38 around the All-Star break, that he's going to be much better. So the question is, do we keep Ohtani in the rotation next year? Hope we get, a number 2 or number 3 starter kind of performance out of him? Or do we put him into a right field or DH role and try to take advantage of that bat? So he will be back. One guy who will not be back is Hayden Yinger, who's looking for about $22 million a year. Younger than Ohtani, 13-10 this year with a 3.86 ERA. He has had a nice run for us in Buffalo over the past 4 years. We traded for him from Toronto, got them to retain a big chunk of his contract to make it attractive for a team like us that doesn't have a huge budget. And over the course of his Buffalo career, he's gone an average of 10-6 each year with a 3.36 ERA, WAR of close to 3, averaging across those 4 seasons. So he's been a nice starter for us, but looking for about $22 million next year. He will not be back. Harleen Susanna will be back with us next year, tied for the NL lead with 16 wins, 16-12 with a 4.76 ERA. But his Sierra was significantly better than that. Looking at his profile, we still hope that he can maybe produce a little more on the mound than he has for us over his first couple years with the team. Andrew Painter will be back. Probably had his best year for us, 12-6 with a 3.98 ERA. Seems like he's kind of settled in more as a 3 or 4 starter. When we traded away one of the top prospects in baseball, Andres Medina, is the centerpiece for the deal to bring Painter on several years ago. We're kind of hoping he was going to be a 2 or a 3 kind of guy, and maybe even a 1. And really, he's realistically more of a 3 or 4 starter. Certainly has his value, and the contract that we did sign him to was somewhat front-loaded. So his numbers over these next several seasons are going to be pretty interesting, especially potentially that team option at only $10 million for his age 32 season. So he is likely to be an important part of our staff for years to come. And then Sean Sullivan, starting to get a little more expensive in arbitration, should be making around $4 million next year, but is definitely settled in to a number 5 role for us in the rotation the last few years, winning records in the majors 3 straight years, as you can see, 13-8 this year with a 4 ERA. So the good news is that we will definitely have our 3, 4, and 5 starters back in Susanna, Painter, and Sullivan. The question is whether we'll have Otani back in the rotation as well, or whether we'll potentially have two spots to fill in the starting rotation next season. Bryce Miller is a guy who was with us for a while. We let him go as a free agent when he was looking for big money, and then we signed him after a year away to a 3-year deal at pretty good numbers. He ended up taking over as our closer this year, was 5-6 with 39 saves after he took over when Andres Munoz got hurt. And he's not making a ton of money next year. We just exercised his option for $1.5 million next season, and he will obviously be back in our bullpen next year, and as of right now, likely to be our closer. Caleb Ferguson, a lefty we traded for this past offseason, got the Dodgers to keep some of his contract, but he's still a relatively expensive bullpen arm for us. But he was very effective for us this year. Had some injury issues, so he did only pitch 34 games for us. But 43 strikeouts and 35 1/3 innings with a 1.02 ERA. Expect him to be hopefully an important part of the bullpen next year. Hopefully we can get 70, 80, 90 innings out of him, and he could certainly be in the mix to be a closer next year as well. Luis Castillo, we picked up before the trade deadline. He will be moving on most likely. He is looking for around $15 million a year. He's going to be 39 years old before next season starts. He was very effective for us out of the bullpen. 2-2 record, 2 saves, 10 holds, but a 1.08 ERA over 50 innings pitched with a whip below 1. So he was definitely effective for us out of the bullpen, and we brought him on board as a potential insurance arm who could start if we did have some material injuries to our starting rotation. Fortunately, that didn't happen, but we will be moving on from Castillo after this year. Zane Adams, a lefty we picked up last offseason in a trade with Houston. 1-5 record, 4.18 ERA over 88 1/3 innings. He is a pretty generic left-handed arm, but still going to be making the major league minimum next year, so we'll likely have him back towards the back end of our bullpen. David Aranya was a Rule 5 pick this past offseason, 26-year-old, similar to what we have with Adams. He's kind of a back end of the bullpen kind of arm. He is a guy that now that we have his rights does have 3 option years left, so we could even give him a little more seasoning if we wanted in AAA. He was fine for us. 2.81 ERA and more than a strikeout per inning with a whip well below 1 in limited action. Love the fact that he throws in the high 90s. So a cheap, solid arm to be in the mix for a bullpen spot next year, certainly. Drew Graham, another left-hander. This is a guy who's kind of grown up in our farm system. 4th-round pick from back in 2024. Finally made his major league debut at the end of this season. Pitched and started the final game of the year for us when we were trying to rest up our top starters for the wild card series. 4.97 ERA over 12 2/3 innings. Obviously a small sample size. He could be in the mix as a number 5 starter next year, particularly if we need to move on from both Otani and Yinger. But in a perfect world, would prefer that we're using him out of the bullpen, or even in the most perfect world, stash him down in AAA because he's just not quite good enough to make the 13-man pitching staff that will likely be breaking spring training with about 4 or 5 months from now, or closer to 6 months, I guess. Franklin Heel, guy that we picked up in a trade with Houston, didn't really do what we had hoped this year. You look at his profile, and on paper, he is a pretty solid relief pitcher, set to make around $2.5 million next year. But a 4.94 ERA, 28 walks, and 74 and two-thirds innings, negative WAR for the season. Willing to bring him back next year. The concern is maybe he just doesn't throw quite hard enough to consistently get major league hitters out. And Jorge Carrillo, another guy who has come up through our farm system, an international free agent signing back in 2025, made his major league debut last year and was then up all of this season. 3-0 record with a 2.37 ERA over 83 and two-thirds innings. I would say right now, even if Ohtani comes back, Carrillo is most likely the guy who would end up being our number 5 starter next year. And certainly if we move on from Ohtani and Yinger and just have Susana, Painter, and Sullivan as established starters, pretty hard to imagine a scenario there where we'd be able to sign or trade for 2 pretty big-time starters, and Carrillo would not be getting an opportunity to work in the rotation next year. So if Ohtani does end up being moved to the outfield, hard to imagine Carrillo's not going to be in the rotation. And even if Ohtani is back in the rotation for us next year, right now Carrillo is probably the first guy who would fill that role of trying to become our number 5 starter behind Ohtani, Susana, Painter, Sullivan, and Carrillo. So it's been a struggle for us to develop players consistently in this playthrough. We've commented on that in previous episodes and previous seasons, and I know some of you have commented on that as well. I think, and we'll be going through our minor league system perhaps at the end of this episode, or if not, at the beginning of the next episode. But I feel like we are starting to get close to having some impact players and more impact players on the major league level, because right now when we look at who's come up through our system, it's Sean Sullivan, who was a second-round pick drafted in 2024, Carrillo, who, as I mentioned, was an international amateur free agent signing, and then Drew Graham, who was a 4th-round pick in 2024. So a couple of guys from that 2024 draft, along with Carrillo, an international amateur free agent in 2025, are really the only homegrown pitchers that we've developed into somewhat productive, or hopefully will be productive, major leaguers thus far in this playthrough. So as I think about our pitching in the offseason, clearly we probably need to add an arm or 2 for the bullpen, and we potentially need to add an arm or 2 for the rotation. The nice thing about having Ohtani signed for next year is that it does give us a lot of optionality depending on what happens this offseason. If over the next couple of months we are able to, either through free agency, the trade market, or the Rule 5 draft, find a starting pitcher or 2 that we really like, then we can potentially move Ohtani to become a hitter. If, on the other hand, we don't have much luck finding pitchers, but we're able to sign a corner outfielder or 2, and we decide to potentially bring back both Takao Ota and Samuel Basallo, who are arbitration eligible, then we have potentially less of a need for Ohtani as a hitter, and we can have him back in the rotation next year. So it's not a decision that we need to make today. It gives us a little more optionality as we head closer to free agency and the trade market and the winter meeting and the Rule 5, as I said. And depending on how those things develop, that may influence what role Ohtani ends up playing on the Buffalo Wings next season. So with that, we'll turn to our offensive players, and I think our situation here is a little unique. I think there's 4 or 5 positions where we really love how we're positioned for next season, and we know exactly who's going to be there. And then we've probably got about 3 positions where, You could argue there's absolutely no clue what I'm going to do with those positions right now. And one of those positions, quite honestly, is DH, where Samuel Basallo just completed his fourth season in the majors. He's been a three-time Silver Slugger winner at designated hitter. I guess he's got a chance to do it again this year, although the 84 ribbies he had this season were by far the fewest of his career, and his WAR was not even one. He is a one-dimensional slugger who did hit those 31 home runs, but he does not bring much to the table defensively. His arbitration number should be around $9 million. We can probably get him for next season. He is a left-handed hitter, which we're a little light on if we move on from both him and Takao Ota, which probably means we need to bring at least one of the two of them back. But a not great year from Basallo. And again, I don't love him because he doesn't bring much to the table with that 40 catcher ability. And at first base, he doesn't really bring much to the table defensively there, other than just the fact that he's 6'4", not a lot of speed, strikes out an inordinate amount of times. He is a one-dimensional slugger, but still one of the more effective hitters on our team. So we're going to have a decision to make on Basallo in arbitration. Adley Rutschman is the highest paid player on our team and will be for several years to come. Have him signed for 3 more years at an average of $37 million a year before a team option for his age 37 season that we will almost certainly not exercise at $41.5 million. So he is likely halfway through his run with us, with 3 years in the books with us. In that 7-year contract. But again, that 7th year, I think it's very unlikely we pick up. And after a really slow start to this season, an amazingly slow start actually, I finished with a pretty solid year. Hit 281, 39 doubles, 13 homers, 114 WRC plus, 115 OPS plus. Had a WAR of over 4 for the third consecutive season with us. And looking at his ratings, they're still kind of what they've always been since he came on board with us. So still probably the best all-around catcher in the game. And taking a look at those batting stats and those batting splits, you look April he hit 211, May 261, in June a $177. He was in the low 200s with his batting average as we approached the All-Star break. But then he hit 306 in July, a blistering 383 in August, and an excellent 342 in September with 15 home runs. So really showed that he's still got a lot at the plate. And when all was said and done, I don't want to say it was a vintage Rutschman season because he has not been quite as productive for us in his early 30s as he was in his mid-20s with the Orioles, but still remains probably, as I said, the top all-around catcher in baseball. Certainly not great value at the money that we're paying him, but it's nice to know that we have one of the best catchers in the game on board. Josh Springer is a guy who was a third-round draft pick back in 2024. And we mentioned earlier that the starting pitchers, Sullivan and Graham, were our second and fourth-round draft picks in that 2024 draft. And Josh Springer, who is now our backup catcher, was our third-round pick that year. Hit 230 in 200 at-bats for us, 6 home runs. Was a negative WAR player. His defense is only average. Clearly, if we could upgrade defensively from him for our backup catcher without having someone who's totally useless in terms of the bat, that would be something to consider. That said, I think with the hope that we're going to get about 130 games from Rutschman next year if everything works out, if we have to play a guy like Springer for 30, 35, maybe 40 games, probably not the end of the world. An acceptable bat and a acceptable-ish glove for the young catcher. And I mentioned earlier that I feel like our farm system is finally starting to pay some dividends, and there's, I think, some more dividends that will be coming up through the organization over the next couple years. Vaughn Necker is one of those. Second round pick in 2025. Got called up at the end of last year, and he spent this entire year with the team, and he was actually in our starting lineup against left-handed pitchers as our designated hitter, or sometimes a corner outfielder, first baseman throughout the season. The issue is that we only played, I believe, 31 games against left-handed starting pitching. So unfortunately, he only started 37 games and only had 129 at-bats. But he was incredibly productive for us in that limited playing time, hitting 364 with 11 doubles and 9 home runs in 129 at-bats. You can see a WRC plus of over 200, a WAR of a run and a half. Certainly going to be back on the team next year. When I look at those batting ratings, I don't believe that he would produce anywhere near to the level that he produced for us this year if we give him 400 or 500 at-bats. But he's a pretty competent hitter against left-handed pitching, and if we have to play him against right-handed pitching from time to time, we can do that. So if we do end up moving on from a Samuel Basala or a Takao Ota, Necker is a guy who could be in line for more playing time next year. But again, Basala with his left-handed bat and Ota with his left-handed bat do join Cam Collier and John Featherston as the only guys who could potentially be back on this team next year who are left-handed hitters. So that certainly works towards us bringing one of those guys back. And speaking about those guys, Takao Ota was our first baseman this year. His arbitration number going to be close to $6 million next year when all is said and done. Hit 246, 25 homers, 81 ribbies. Somewhat similar to Basalo. He has been with us for exactly 4 years at this point. Is pretty much a one-dimensional slugger who does not bring much to the table in terms of speed or his defensive ability. Like Basalo, he had a WAR of below 1 this year. So the numbers through arbitration for both of them aren't oppressive, with them both coming off of somewhat down seasons. I just don't know if we need both of them back next year. So I would certainly think that over the next couple of weeks particularly, we're going to try shopping both Basalo and Ota to maybe find a starting pitcher, to maybe find a corner outfielder, to maybe find a prospect or two for our system. And if we can get something decent in return for one of those guys, that'll open up some more money for us to spend in free agency this year and potentially bring an interesting player who can help us this year or in the future in return. So their roster spots definitely still uncertain for next year, at least in my mind. Austin Riley, we just declined a team option at $22 million next year. He's a guy that we picked up approaching the trade deadline. Really took over as our first baseman against left-handed pitchers. Did not do much, hitting just 230 with 2 home runs. 34 years old. Honestly, he's a little better defensively than a Basalo or an Ota, but he's also a guy who's looking for not dissimilar money to those two guys. A little less at around $5 million a year for 4 years. Could we bring him back at that kind of number if we decided to move on from a Basalo or an Ota? Perhaps. I don't think it's at the top of the list of things we want to focus on this offseason, but he could potentially be back with us next year at that much more reasonable number than the $22 million that we declined. Deshaun Seifu was our number 1 overall pick in 2026. He made it to the major leagues out of Fordham late that year, and he has been with us pretty much ever since. A little disappointed that his defensive ratings have regressed a little bit, even though he's only 27 years old. He was a Gold Glove winning shortstop his first 2 full seasons in the majors, and now is definitely not at that kind of level. You know, you look at what he did at second base this year, and he's above average in terms of his zone rating and his defensive efficiency, but I don't think he's exceptional. But where he is exceptional is with his speed and wreaking havoc on the base paths. Led the league in steals for a 4th consecutive year this year with 63. You can see he has previously led the league in triples 3 times and hit 9 and 11 the last couple of years. So he is a pretty dynamic offensive player. The 5.6 WAR that he put up this year was the 2nd highest of his career. He's never going to walk enough to be putting up massive OPS plus numbers, but still a very interesting offensive player, and likely will be our leadoff hitter for several years to come, since we several years ago at this point signed him to a contract that bought out his arbitration years as well as several of his free agent years. So he should be with us playing either second base, or depending on how things change with our team over the years, could he end up at third base? Could he end up as a left fielder? Perhaps. But one thing that is certain is that we're going to ensure that his bat is in the lineup somewhere for us for years to come. Willy Adames, we traded from the Cubs this past June. View him, with the Cubs having kept a big chunk of his contract, as our utility infielder for the next few seasons. He didn't play great for us, hit just 200 over 105 at-bats, but did display some power with 8 home runs in those 105 at-bats. Good in the clubhouse, versatile defensively. We're going to train him up to be a third baseman also in spring training next year. View him as a utility guy at the age of 36 with the profile he has. But if he has to play second, third, or even short for us for a period of time, I think we could do a lot worse than Adames in a utility infielder role. Cam Collier made a big trade with the White Sox for him this year. He was primarily a third baseman for us, although we did play him in right field at times, given our problems manning that position. Hit 299 for us, 31 doubles, 18 homers, 130 WRC plus, a WAR over 4. Think that he is a pretty important player for us for years to come. He's hitting his arbitration years now, going to make about $4 million next year. Certainly a guy that we would also consider trying to sign to a long-term contract. Tim Hull, a guy who was a third-round pick of ours in 2036, finally made his major league debut this year when we turned the shortstop role over to him when didn't quite work out as we hoped with rental Dansby Swanson this year. And Hull did fine, hit 263 for us with 23 doubles and 278 at-bats, close to an average player offensively, and had a WAR of close to 2 thanks to some pretty good defense. We thought his range was a 70 a few months ago, so a little disappointing that we don't think his defensive range is quite what we had hoped. That said, he still has a bat that looks like it could be a average-ish major league bat with a respectable glove at shortstop. In a perfect world, would I rather be playing him at second base or third? Probably. But I think at this point he is our most realistic option at shortstop for the next few years. Still hope that bat will develop a little more. But as I mentioned, if he is close to major league average with his bat, I think he'll be a pretty valuable and cost-effective player for us for the next few years, making the major league minimum. And last but not least, among the infielders, I mentioned Dansby Swanson, who we picked up when we traded away Marcelo Meyer. He is going to be a free agent now. Had some injury issues, had some production issues, hit 244 for us with 6 homers and 127 at-bats. below average offensively and basically a replacement level player when we factored in his deteriorating defense. He had a option for over 20 million this year that did not vest. He's still looking for about $7.5 million a year, given that we feel like we are set at second with Seifu, we are set at third with Collier, we are set at short with Hull, and we are set for a utility infielder with Adames. And then we also certainly have Necker as a either starting first baseman or a potential utility infielder slash outfielder. Hard for me to foresee a scenario where we'd want to be paying Dansby Swanson anywhere near $7 million next year, so he will likely be one and done with us. Vance Honeycutt, a guy we picked in the 8th round of that 2024 draft, came up at a similar time to Deshaun Seifu, and those guys over the last 4.5 seasons at the major league level have almost certainly been our two most valuable players. Honeycutt started the year on the IL and is now fragile in terms of his injury proneness, but had arguably his best season ever, even though he played only 138 games for us this year, with the fact that he missed those first few weeks of the season. 287 average, 26 homers, a career high, 96 ribbies, 39 stolen bases, 127 WRC plus. For his career, he's at 125. He's been an incredibly consistent player over the course of his career. His WRC plus is between 120 and 127 every year. The 5 WAR tied for a career high. His arbitration number is starting to get up there, close to $9 million for this coming season. And then he is expected to be at about 16 for the year after next. Some of you, most recently, 3/4 Badger, have kind of asked me in the comments and wondered what we're thinking about with him in terms of a long-term contract. And it's a great question. Certainly based on his offensive production, would love to have him be our left fielder for the foreseeable future. But given that he is fragile at this point, he's going to be turning 29 next year, and he's only looking for a 1-year contract. But if we try to get a bigger extension for us, he's looking for about $23 million a year. I don't know that I want to make that type of long-term commitment to him right now. I think I probably suck it up and go year to year the next 2 years, pay him whatever we have to pay him through arbitration, and just hopefully ensure that over the next couple seasons he remains productive and doesn't suffer any further injuries that really impact his batting ratings or make him wrecked in terms of his injury proneness. And then 2 winters from now, potentially try to sign him to a longer term contract if we think that's the right play. But right now I don't know about guaranteeing a long-term deal given that he's already fragile physically. John Featherston, one of the few left-handed hitters that we know is going to be back, and as some of you have noted in comments to recent episodes, he's kind of an unsung hero of this team. We picked him up a year and a half ago at this point in a trade with the Braves. Figured if we could get average major league bat from him with that 70 outfield range in center field and good speed, he could be a really good player for us. And we've gotten a lot more from him offensively than I ever thought we would. Hit 276 this year, but 35 doubles, 7 triples, 18 homers. Also even stole 12 bases for us. So he put up a 113 OPS plus and a WAR of close to 3.5 on the season. He's another guy who is now heading into his arbitration eligible years, but certainly have no problem paying him about $3.5 million next year. Another guy to potentially think about a long-term deal with. Looks like he's looking for an average of about $14 million a year. for 9 years to keep him on board. So we'd be buying out 3 arbitration years and then getting into free agency, and he wants a player opt out in there. Something for us to consider through the off season. We do have a fair amount of outfielders, including potential center fielders that we have drafted or picked up in international amateur free agency over the past several years. So I think I am a little more inclined to just maybe play out the next couple of arbitration seasons. We've got 3 arbitration seasons ahead of us, so we don't have to make a rash decision on Featherston. But given that he's going to be 28 soon, he's going to be in his early 30s by the time he's free agency eligible. So I don't feel like we have to make a decision right now. Love the durability, like the speed, love the defensive range, and the bat, as I said, has been better than we have hoped. So completely agree with those of you who say that Featherston is a bit of a unsung hero for this Buffalo Wings team. And then Jared Kelenic is a guy that we picked up before the trade deadline in a trade with Pittsburgh. Ended up hitting just 201 for us in 259 at-bats. Did have 10 doubles and 9 homers, but was a well below average player offensively. Don't think he will be back with us next year. We got Pittsburgh to retain a good chunk of his contract, and he's still looking for over $20 million a year for 3 years. Given what he is at this point in his career, I think we will be moving on from Kelenic this offseason. And just a few other players to check in on who did not spend much, if any, time in the majors this year, but are still on our 40-man roster. Shaylin Polanco, a guy that we picked up in a trade with Miami last year, was up in Buffalo very briefly this year. Hit 265 with 27 homers for AAA Albany. Certainly with Kelenic moving on, he would be in the mix for a corner outfield spot next year, but would rather he be a 4th or 5th outfielder for us potentially rather than a starting right fielder. Tanner Shillette, guy that we picked up in a trade with Washington a couple years ago at this point, was a backup catcher for us a season ago this year, with the fact that we brought up Springer, who's a little bit better defensively. Shillette spent most of the year in AAA Albany. Still has good power, hitting 20 home runs there, but don't view him as a big part of our future at about 28 years old. And he's also, in his last option year. So once players like that kind of lose the ability to be optioned somewhere, their value can decline materially, in my opinion. Toshi Mitsukato is another guy we may look to move on from. He's a minor league free agent signing out of Japan from a few years ago. We've always loved his defense. We've always loved his personality. We've liked his speed and his ability to bunt. Just don't think he is a major league hitter. He's only 24 years old. Hit just 223 in Buffalo last year, and he wasn't even up in the majors this year. Spent the whole year in Albany where he hit 238. Did have 24 doubles and 12 home runs. Still has 1 option year left, so don't necessarily have to move on from him, but if he helped get us a trade done for someone who we felt was a bigger part of our future, certainly would be willing to move on from him. Rafael Radillo is a Rule 5 pick from almost 2 years ago at this point. Spent all of last year with us in Buffalo, so we retained his rights. This year he hit 240 with 23 homers in Albany. Was reasonably productive in the 24 at-bats he had at the major league level. Similar to Shaylin Polanco, he is in the mix to be a potential backup outfielder for us next year. We've been playing him at first base just to try to diversify his optionality as much as we can. He is not a good defensive first baseman, but at 6'2", if we have to put him there, we can. Have a hard time believing that both Rafael Radillo and Shaylin Polanco would be on the 26-man roster next year, but is it possible that one of them makes it? Definitely. And then pitching-wise, didn't mention Kyle Backus, who's out with a partially torn labrum. He's going to be in the mix for us as a reliever again next year. I'm going to be making a little over $1 million. Ended up getting injured in the playoffs, but was 7-2 for us this year. Very effective against left-handers. 79 strikeouts, more than a strikeout an inning. 2.97 ERA, and as I mentioned, he's very pedestrian against right-handed batters, but he is pretty tough on left-handers, so he's certainly in the mix to be a left-handed specialist for us again next season. And other than that, I think those are kind of the players that we have and the players that we're thinking about as we look ahead to arbitration. Sullivan, we're going to make an offer to. Backus, we're going to make an offer to. Heel, although he was disappointing, and as some of you noted in the comments, particularly in the playoffs, probably will give him another shot. Collier, Honeycutt, and Featherston, obviously we're bringing those three guys back. The only real decisions we're going to have over the next few weeks is Basallo and Ota. Do we want to pay about $9 million to Basallo? Do we want to pay, 5.7, $5.8 million to Takao Ota? They're basically the same player, one-dimensional sluggers who hit a lot of home runs, strike out a lot, and bring nothing to the table defensively. If we can turn one or both of them into useful assets, may make sense to try to free up a little more money before free agency by moving on from one or both of them. Another move we've got to think about is Hayden Yinger. As I mentioned, he's looking for pretty big money, $22.4 million a year for 4 years. We can't afford to pay him that. We don't want to pay him that. But I am tempted to submit a $18.9 million qualifying offer to him, and for the time being, I'm going to do it. Given that he's looking for $22 million plus a year over 4 years, I think it's likely that he will reject that QO, which will mean we'll at least get a little bit of draft pick compensation for him when he does end up signing with somebody else. If he signs the QO, that's kind of our offseason. I mean, that's our big acquisition to bring him back into our starting rotation. Probably means if we have him back and we potentially take the opportunity to move Carrillo into the starting rotation, that we would be sliding Ohtani into right field to probably start in the outfield alongside Honeycutt and Featherston. So I don't think he'll accept that qualifying offer, but if he does, we'll have him back for one more year. And as I said, that would likely mean that Ohtani will be a right fielder for us or a DH for us next year. But it's a little bit of a risk, but given that he's only 31 years old and he's looking for $4 million, around $89 million, I don't think he'll accept that QO. I think he's going to have enough confidence in his abilities to hit free agency, and at least we'll get a little bit of draft compensation if and when he does move on from us. And before we finish up this episode, we will take a look at some of the top prospects in our farm system and how they did this year. We'll wait until our next episode to do our annual check of some other prospects across other minor league teams that have either been on our team in the past or that we thought about drafting or trading for or picking up in international amateur free agency. Or some of you have noted over the years that you would have picked these guys instead of the guys that we picked. Always like to kind of check in on those guys and track how they're doing too. But in the interest of time, we'll focus on our farm system at the end of this episode, and then next episode, as we really dig into the offseason in earnest, we'll visit some of those players on other teams. So looking at our farm system, we're middle of the pack in terms of our rankings, but we do have 5 top 100 prospects at this time. At this point, led by Humberto Duque, international free agent signing from almost 4 years ago. At this point, number 44 prospect in baseball, now 20 years old. The issue with him is making contact with the ball. He's been on the interstate his 2 years in rookie ball. Did hit 10 home runs this year in 167 at bats, but he's also struck out more than 50% of the time, both of his years in rookie ball. You take a look at his ratings relative to the Dominican League, and the home run power is above average, but the contact and the void strikeouts is bad, even for that level of ball. He is a guy who is the number 44 prospect in baseball still, with the struggles he's had to make contact and the fact he doesn't bring much, if anything, defensively and on the base paths to us. If there was an opportunity to pick up a good young player, notably a starting pitcher or maybe a corner outfielder that we could build around for a few years to come, I would definitely consider moving on from Duque this offseason if there's any value in him as the number 44 prospect in baseball. Because we've got Arturo Flores, who an international free agent signing from a couple years later, who's listed as the number 57 prospect in baseball, about a year younger than Duque. We kept him down this year. We're going to let him make his rookie league debut next year. Like his personality, but similar to Duque, not much defensively, not much speed, and a pretty similar batting profile at this point. The one thing I will say is he's already got better home run power for the Dominican League, even though he's a year younger, but same issue. His contact and his avoid strikeouts are poor, even for the DSL Rookie League, but a very similar profile to Duque. Who knows if either of them will make it, and if we trade one away, hopefully we won't trade the wrong one away, but these guys are both pretty one-dimensional first basemen / DHs who may not develop. If we can get value for one of those guys this offseason and bring on someone who we think can help our team, probably makes sense to consider moving on from one of them. And it looks like with the offish year that we had a year ago, when although we were in the playoffs, we were barely just above 500, we are going to be able to allocate a little more to international amateur free agency next year. So we'll do that right now to just ensure that we don't forget to do that. Dave Zapp, a guy that we picked 5th overall in 2028, listed as the number 59 prospect in baseball. Looks like he's finally ready to progress to A-ball next year. Got his batting average up to 264 this year. Did hit 11 homers and 193 at-bats. Don't feel great about the fact that he ended up spending 3 full seasons in rookie ball for us. And when you look at his batting stats, obviously he also spent a good part of a 4th season with us after we drafted him. Not the way that we draw things up when you pick a player 5th overall, but at least at this point when we look at the FSL with him next year, he looks like a guy who should be able to hold his own in the FSL, similar to a lot of other prospects, though. He's been striking out at a pretty insane rate, and it doesn't look like that's going to improve anytime soon. But with that 65 outfield range, he could be a decent left fielder for us. Could play center field in a pinch. Could also play first base. Just have to hope that bat continues to develop over the next few years. Already 21 years old. Certainly hasn't developed the way that we would have hoped, but I don't think he is a complete lost cause at this point too. Don't love having a guy in rookie ball for 4 seasons, but I think it seems like he's finally starting to progress a little bit in terms of his abilities and his performance on the field. So hopefully next year we can get him into A ball and hopefully high A ball before the end of the season. And if things go really well, maybe even have him play a few games in Double A at the end of the year. Joe Edwards is a guy who was a second round pick drafted in 2027. Another guy who's taken a while to catch fire, but you can see his ratings relative to A ball are pretty good now. Granted, he's almost 23 years old, number 89 prospect in baseball. But had a nice year for us this year, a monster season actually when you think about it. Combined for 51 home runs between high A ball and Double A Utica. And he will probably start next year in Double A, but certainly will be playing at Triple A at some point before the end of the season. I guess, another guy, except for the avoiding strikeouts, could probably play him in Triple A even at the start of next year. So given that he'll be 23 by the start of the season, and he did hit 314 in 105 at-bats in Double A, maybe we look at where the coaches are the best suited to develop him, and he gets along best with the coaches, and use that to kind of position him for next season. But he is a guy who could definitely help with one of the biggest weaknesses on our team, which is our inability to draw walks. He's already excellent, even at the major league level, in terms of drawing walks. Walked 118 times this past season. Granted, he did strike out over 200 times, but his on-base percentages were well over 400 at both levels. Not a great defensive infielder, and not a great defensive outfielder either, but he is a player who could play competent-ish defense at a number of different positions, and good to see him at the point where you could conceivably see him being a September call-up potentially next year, and then a regular contributor for us in 2032. Another guy who made some progress this year is Isidro Ochoa. You may remember we thought about drafting him back a few years ago, and we ended up picking him up in the trade when we traded away Ali Ostendorf, who was one of the top pitching prospects in our system. Ochoa split this year between high A ball and Double A, same as Joe Edwards, was 7-3 with a 3.31 ERA in high A Jamestown, and then slipped to 3-7 with a 4.84 ERA at Double A Utica. Barely 22 years old. He was 21 while the minor league season was going on, so listed as the number 94 prospect in baseball. The issue with him is the number of guys that he's going to be walking. We look at those ratings relative to Major League Baseball, though, and his fastball, his sinker, and his cutter are kind of already there. It's just a matter of really kind of getting that last little boost to his stuff, and getting his control up a little bit. He's got extreme ground ball tendencies. His movement is excellent already. Doesn't give up a ton of home runs, and hopefully won't at the major league level. I think he will probably start the year at AAA Albany for us, and similar to Edwards, I think he is a guy who could be a September call-up next year, and certainly could be a member of our starting rotation potentially in the 2033 season if everything goes well. So if Yinger does end up accepting that qualifying offer from us, having one more year of Yinger and then potentially turning a spot in the starting rotation over to Ochoa would not be the worst way for things to go down. So those are our 5 top 100 prospects. A few other guys to look at. Tyreek Hardage, second-round pick from 2028. Another guy who finally got out of rookie ball this past year, and he split the year between A ball, where he hit 263 with 11 homers, and then we moved up to high A, where he hit 298 with 5 homers in Jamestown. Certainly going to be 22 years old at the beginning of this upcoming season. And you look at his ratings relative to the Double A Eastern League, and that seems like a very logical spot to start him. With that 70 outfield range and that 60 outfield arm, think he could be an outstanding right fielder for us in a few years. If we do end up deciding not to sign Featherston to a long-term contract, could he conceivably be the answer in center field for us in a few years? Definitely would love the outfield error rating to be higher for any position, particularly center field, but most importantly, it looks like he can track down a lot of balls in the outfield. He's got really good speed on the base paths, a pretty good bunter, and it looks like his bat could be decent. So that's part of the reason why I don't feel like necessarily making a long-term commitment to Featherston quite yet, because we may have a more economical version of Featherston coming up through our organization in a few years. And with the 5 top 100 prospects that we mentioned and Tyreek Hardage, that is it for top 200 prospects in our organization. We'll check in real quickly on a few of these other guys who are the bigger prospects. Sincere Shazier, 4th round pick in 2028. Finally made it out of rookie ball this year, but was 7-8 with a 5.84 ERA in Class A marathon. Certainly is a profile that indicates he could be a back end of the rotation starter down the line if everything works out. Tegan Tiley was our 1st round draft pick this past year. We were bringing him on from Canada despite the poor level of competition that he faced up there, and he did pretty well in rookie ball. Hit 292, 4 home runs and 120 at-bats. Only 19 years old. Probably will spend another year in rookie ball next year, but think that he's not going to be a guy who's going to need to be in rookie ball for 4 years, like we've experienced with a guy like Dave Zapp. Steve Anderson, shortstop, who was our 1st round pick a year ago in 2030, and he was more productive this year in rookie ball, raised his batting average by about 30 points, doubled the number of home runs he hit, and was an above average offensive player. You look at his ratings relative to the FSL. Contact and strikeouts are an issue. We'll see what he looks like at the beginning of next year. Maybe he needs one more year of rookie level seasoning, but maybe we could also get him up to A ball next year. Juan Ernesto McDonald, a similar guy, our 2nd round pick from 2030, hit 275 with 13 home runs for us. Question is really going to be whether his bat develops enough. Like the defensive ability as a catcher, like the personality, but you can see relative to the FSL, his contact is a definite issue. So probably needs one more year of rookie level seasoning, but still could become a useful potential backup shortstop for us down the line. Earl Lintel, 4th round pick this year out of Canada. And he had a monster year for us in very limited playing time. He ended up getting hurt, but he did hit 346 and 78 at-bats, only 19 years old. But he looks like, even though he's only played 20 games in rookie ball, he's someone who we could consider moving up to the FSL at the age of 19 next year. So pretty good for a 4th round pick out of Canada. Nate Kimmel, guy who was a 3rd round pick drafted in 2028. He's a guy who's finally started moving up through the system the past couple years. Hit 314 with 10 homers, and look at this extra base hit profile. 13 doubles, 9 triples, and 10 homers in Class A this year. And then we moved him up to high A ball, 7 doubles, 4 triples, and 6 home runs. So definitely taking advantage of that contact and gap power and speed to just be slamming the ball all over the park. 22 years old. You look at his ratings relative to the Double A Eastern League, and he seems like a guy who probably starts next year in Double A. What's his defensive position down the line? I don't know, but he is a guy who looks like he could be a poor man's version of Deshaun Seifu in a few years. Not quite as good defensively, not quite as good offensively, but similarly productive on the base paths and potentially great gap power. So he's another guy who we're interested in seeing what he can become over the next few years. Check in on, not going to check in on everybody else, but just highlight a few players. Jonathan Joy, starting pitching prospect who we picked in the third round back in 2030, 1-4 with an 8.17 ERA in rookie ball this year. We drafted him thinking he may end up as a reliever. Who knows whether he's going to develop into anything at all. Tim Gaglia, first round pick from back in 2029, and we finally got him out of rookie ball this year. Hit 267 in 90 at-bats in rookie ball. We moved him up to Class A Marathon, where he was not great, hitting just 227. We'll have him back in Marathon likely at the start of next season. He looks like he's certainly capable of playing at that level. And he is still a guy who, if he develops to the level that we think he can, could still be an interesting center fielder for us down the line. Outfield range, 70, above average error and arm ratings, decent speed. Question with him is whether the bat is going to develop, but with Gaglia likely beginning next year in A-ball, and Hardage, who we talked about, likely beginning in Double A. That's part of the reason why, as much as we love Featherston in center field for the last few years, don't necessarily feel like we need to sign him to a long-term deal right away. A couple final guys to look at. Juan Villapando, third-round pick from this past year. Hit just 216 with 4 homers in his first action as a professional. Juan Medina, a second-round pick from 2029, hit 276 this year, his third year in rookie ball. Looking at his rankings relative to the FSL, probably will promote him this coming year. His ability to draw walks and his ability to avoid strikeouts still a concern, but probably will let him at the age of 21 by early next year see what he can do at the A-ball level rather than rookie ball. And then Ron Brady, second round pick from this past season, hit 240 but did have 7 homers and 104 at-bats. He's only 19 years old. Does not look quite ready for A-ball, so he will probably be back in rookie ball again next season. And if you are still watching at this point, hope you enjoyed the summary of the minor league system. Hope you enjoyed the review of what our roster looked like in this 2031 season and our initial thoughts of what we think it might look like in 2032. If you've got thoughts on who we should bring back and who we shouldn't bring back, would love to hear those in the comments. If you've got thoughts on maybe who we should consider moving on from in the minor league system, or who we should never trade away no matter what the offer, would love your ideas on those types of things as well. And if you have thoughts on anything else, would also love to hear those. As I mentioned, in our next episode, we'll begin the off-season in earnest, and we will also check in on some of those minor leaguers from other organizations in Major League Baseball, see whether some of the moves that we've made, or more accurately not made, involving some of those players in other systems over the years, were wise or not, and see how some of those guys are developing in our next episode. Until then, thanks so much for watching, and hope you have a great day.